here. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in under the question section. I do not monitor the chat section, so I won't be able to answer those, and we will table any questions till the end of the webinar. I don't expect us to be a full hour today. I have several examples, but I don't believe it will go that distance today. This topic was surprisingly very well received. We had 78 attendees, which is the most we've had in probably a year on a Lunch and Learn. 78 attendees want to see this particular webinar. So it did get very popular very quickly. I'd like to start off just by asking or using a few polls to try to figure out why this is something that everyone wants to see. So my first poll, I'm going to go ahead and launch this here. Okay. If you could just take a moment, and I want to find out if people are using layouts and parts and assemblies now or not. Okay, we've got about 60% voted. Give a few more seconds here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this and share the results with you here. Taking a look, it's pretty well split. Some doing part, some doing assembly, some doing both, but there's also a good group of folks that are using neither. My second poll here has to do maybe with, since you're using them, what struggles do you have while using layouts in SolidWorks? If you could just take a second and answer this question. Are you not sure of the best approach? I know SolidWorks has changed their approach to doing layouts over the last 5 releases. I've had customers bring up to me that they don't like dealing with restraints between what turns out to be different components within the system. People still tend to go back and use their 2D tool. Maybe it's comfort, maybe it's something else. And taking that 2D and actually creating the 3D in the end. I'm going to go ahead and share this one. This is very interesting. Let's share these results. It looks like most of you are just not sure which way to go with the approach on these layout sketches, and I hope today we'll clarify what SolidWorks sees as the best approach for doing layouts in parts and assemblies. Okay, and I understand the whole idea of the 2D tool. You have that comfort level. You don't have restraints. Hopefully, some of these tools that I show you today will help overcome some of that and help you take that 2D data and take it one step further. The last poll I have before we get started here, I just want to find out how comfortable folks are using blocks. One of the things that we have to cover and start with here today when we're dealing with layouts is dealing with blocks in SolidWorks. That's really the basis for everything that we're going to do, and it's going to help us avoid creating relationships in sketches because we're creating them as blocks that don't necessarily need all that information in them. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this and show you the results. It looks like, a majority of you, need a little brushing up. I take it on blocks. Let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go ahead and hide our poll, and you should be seeing my PowerPoint at this point. Layout sketches in SolidWorks, just to give you a definition of what we're talking about here. Layout sketches is a top-down design method that can be used in both parts and assemblies. At the assembly level and at the part level, for that matter, we use sketch blocks as the basis for building these layouts. We'll construct one or more sketches. The sketches individually will represent the components of the assembly themselves, and I've got several examples of that. Now we really need to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. And I know most of you are here because you know the advantages of doing a quick layout, not worrying about all the things that we have to do in SolidWorks to make and put something together for a very quick layout of what an assembly might look like. Advantages of doing layout sketches, however, in SolidWorks, this is for parts or assemblies, you can control every aspect of the assembly from a single set of sketches or blocks, I should add. Now, layout sketches can also serve as prototypes before the modeling starts. We can reuse some or all of that information to create the parts and assemblies. They're highly reusable. If I want to take a layout sketch and save that information and reuse it somewhere else along the line, I can absolutely do that. Now, some of the disadvantages. When I get to creating layout sketches, the dimensional data, not all of the dimensional data, resides within the solid model. We actually control everything by the sketch or the sketch blocks that we have. Now, changing the sketches and relations in the layout can cause model errors because we're transferring that information from the sketch all the way up through. It's possible. It seems to be pretty robust after this recent change. Some sketch tools do not work in layout sketches. Okay, so there are some things to kind of look out for here. Some of the skills that you'll need to be proficient in doing layout sketches, you have to be very comfortable top-down design, editing parts, editing assembly, those types of things. Obviously, the basis in SolidWorks, you got to be able to sketch. We're going to teach you quite a bit today about dealing with blocks, what's a local block. We're going to talk about the layout feature in SolidWorks, how to get in and out and suppress and hide and deal with that particular feature. One of the things that's always been brought up to me is relations. How do I build these things without having so many relationships built into that? We're going to talk about some of the automatic relation tools, how to turn those off, and how I don't even really have to build relations if I don't want to. The ability to create a block library. This is the whole idea of reusing some of that data. And obviously we need to be able, once we create these layouts and these blocks, how do I make parts from them? Okay, just a little bit of block review before I go in. I'm going to actually create a couple blocks here. A block allows you to create multiple pieces of sketch geometry and dimensions so they move as one sketch. Fantastic for layouts. Very nice for testing 2D mechanisms, which I'm going to show a lot of in this webinar today. And again, we can use these to create 3D parts. Okay, some of the key topics of what I'm going to go through here. We're going to go out through part and assembly layout design, the differences in parts and assemblies as it pertains to layouts, creating and inserting blocks, and how to create parts from these layout sketches. So let's go ahead and get going here. I'm going to pop into my SolidWorks. I'm going to start with a new file here to start with. We'll just, doesn't really matter. I'm going to stick in the part environment to start with here. Now, the first thing I want to point out, there's a couple of toolbars that are useful when dealing either in the part or assembly level for layouts. Because they are kind of all block-based, there is a toolbar specifically for blocks, but there is also a toolbar specifically for layouts. This is something that was added a few releases ago, and it kind of combines all the things that we would use in a layout sketch into one toolbar, including some of our snap functionality. We talked a little bit at the beginning of the webinar about how do I turn off certain relations or not deal with certain relationships automatically. That's one way with snaps, but it's kind of grouped them all together in here. Another toolbar that I'm going to bring up a little bit later, let me get this thing down here, is the line format toolbar. The line format toolbar has some things on it that I'll use as far as changing colors of blocks to differentiate between components. There's also another tool called color display mode that I'm going to touch on. So let's go ahead and create a block. let's just start with a sketch here on the front plane. I don't really care what the block looks like at this point. Maybe I'm creating a logo that I'm going to reuse. Maybe I'm creating a sketch that I'm going to reuse in a part. Again, a block is a series of sketch entities or dimensions that can be reused over and over. So I've placed a bunch of sketch entities. I can go ahead and maybe dimension some of this information if I like. Maybe the critical pieces. Maybe I want this to be 50 millimeters in height. Now, I want to be clear about these blocks. You don't have to go to the nth degree as far as restraining things. This allows you to be somewhat sloppy at this point. Because we're going to reuse this later to create the assemblies, that's when we can do some of the finalizing of this information. When I'm ready to create a block, you can see that my layout toolbar is now activated for me. You'll see on that layout toolbar a command called make block. It's also on the block toolbar. If you're looking in the pull-down menu, it's tools, block, make. Okay, and you'll also see it, which I thought was kind of nice. It's pretty much always on your pop-up toolbar. Now you can just right-click, grab Make Block. That will bring up the block dialog, and you select the entities that you want to make part of the block. Now it's pretty clear if I were dragging these around now, several things are unrestrained. The lines would change length, the circle would change size, but I'm going to go ahead and make them into a block. The second option I have on here is something called the Insertion Point. The Insertion Point allows me to dictate when I'm dragging this into an assembly layout what point snaps to other points that you're on top of. It's like a mate for blocks. It's almost like a smart mate. This is the point which will snap, and you'll see me when I'm adding blocks a little bit later what actually happens here. Now, once I've created the block, all of these entities are movable all as one big chunk. Okay, I can drag them around the screen. I'm not worried about constraints of my sketch, lengthening of my line. You know, I didn't even fully constrain or dimension this particular item. Now, it will show up as a subcomponent to the sketch, as a child to the sketch. And I can continue while I'm still in this sketch creating more blocks if I'd like to. Maybe I want to create a slot block. Again, I'm just laying it out. I'm not worried about the dimensions. I can make a second block of those entities, and that will show up under that same sketch. Now, one of the habits you will want to get into, F2 and your Windows slow click will allow you to rename the blocks. So I'll call this my triangle. We'll call this my slot. If I get my slow click here, guess I got to be slower. Okay, maybe I won't rename it. I want to show you how we edit the geometry. Obviously right now, even though I'm in the sketch, I don't have the ability to edit that geometry. So when you're ready to edit those individual pieces, all you have to do is right click on the block itself, and you're going to find an edit block option. Edit block takes you right in there. Maybe I decide I want to add another dimension in here of 25 to set the size so I can position it to another one. Now we have two blocks that are here inside a single sketch, and I can actually start to create relationships between the blocks. I can drag maybe the center of that triangle onto there. Maybe I want the bottom edge of the triangle horizontal, and all I've done is create something very simple. This motion may not come through too well on the webinar there, but again, they're treated as two separate blocks. Couple other things that we can do with blocks at the part level here. If you right click on a block, you have the ability to save that block. Okay, that takes you from what we call a local block, which is a block that exists inside a sketch only, to creating your own library of reusable blocks. Now I have some blocks save out here. You just give a name, and the extension is an SLDBLK, and you can save it anywhere within the system here. Find a proper storage spot. Now another thing that we can do with blocks, if you right-click on them, is explode them. Now explode block is kind of like deleting them without deleting the entities. If I explode a block, the block now disappears from my block list under that sketch, and all the entities go back to their original state. Okay? So those are some of the basics with blocks. Let's go through a simple part layout and talk about how we can create a part from a layout. So here's my approach here. We'll go ahead and start a part in millimeters, and I want to lay out a weldment, a very simple plate with pipe coming off of it. So we'll go ahead and pick the plane I want to work with here. Now this is going to vary whether you're working in a part or in an assembly. Now I know what the plate overall dimensions are. We're going to be 100 by 100. And I need to know where the center of this thing is, so I'm going to use a center line and a point to locate that. Okay, now I want to also put the location for the pipe, and I'm not really sure where I'm going to place the welded pipe at this point. I do know the wall thickness, so we'll go ahead and put a dimension between the two concentric circles of 2 millimeters. But I can't position its location yet. Now as far as creating the block, I'm still in the sketch, so let's go ahead and go down to my layout and select Make Block. Select the entities I want as part of the first block. Now notice I don't have to pick the dimensions. The dimensions associated with it will automatically go along with it. I can give it an insertion point if I like. In this case I'm not reusing it, so it isn't going to matter. And then for my second block, I can just window select and do Make Block on that one as well. Okay, let's rename this our base. And this is our pipe. Okay. Now, when we're ready to reuse this information, it's important. I'm going to show you kind of a gotcha that I found, and I think several people may run into. If you're in the layout sketch itself, what you can't do is grab an existing block entity and try to convert it. Notice as soon as I went to convert, it didn't allow me to take any of those entities forward. However, if this is truly a layout sketch for a part, what you can do is exit that sketch. I can then create another sketch on the same plane if I like. At that point, I can then select the entire block and convert it. This creates that on-edge relationship that we're all used to, and I could go ahead and extrude this block up whatever distance I like. Okay? Now the same thing happens for the other. I can go ahead and select a sketch on the face. I can grab my pipe, convert it, and go ahead and create the second feature from it. Now this being a weldment layout, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my merge result. And now you're presented with two bodies from the initial layout. Now one of the comments about layout sketches was that everything is driven from the sketch itself. If I expand the boss and I go to edit the sketch, I'm still dealing with fully constrained geometry, no dimensions, nothing. I have to go back to the original base and pipe blocks to modify them. Now again, how do I modify? I just right click, edit block, and it brings me right back into the original block. Okay, so I can come in here. Maybe I want to move position, change position on this thing. Why it's not letting me here? Let's see. Alright, we'll go ahead and drive that over there. Now as soon as I exit the block itself, all the geometry will update. Now I've seen several customers that do part layouts, and they just create a single sketch that contains all of the information needed for the layout. The difference between this approach and that approach has to do really with the relationships between the separate features, I guess I'll call them. I didn't have to worry too much about the relationships between the center point of those circles and the rest of the geometry. You actually create less relationships by creating these blocks. You have less references too. That sketch gets very busy. Here you can hide blocks. It makes it a lot easier to kind of work with. And again, remember, you can go ahead and save those out to reuse those later. So here's a simple part layout. We're going to continue showing some more of that in just a moment. I want to start in an assembly for an assembly layout. So we're going to start an assembly in millimeters here. Now, this is something that has changed in SolidWorks philosophy over the last few releases, how we create these layouts. You'll notice when you begin assembly, every time now, you get an option to create a layout inside the assembly. A layout is a very special 3D sketch, and that's important to remember. It's a 3D sketch inside of an assembly. If I select Create Layout, the system in this case is automatically going to create a sketch for me, a 3D sketch positioned on the front plane. Now if I want to go to another plane, I just double click on it. Okay, this truly is a 3D sketch. In this case, we're going to position everything off the front plane, so I'm going to go ahead and go normal to it here. And I'm going to start to draw my very first assembly component layout. I'm going to start with my line tool here, and we're going to draw something very simple and dimension it. Again, the dimensions, it's up to you how much information you're placing in these, because you're the one that's going to reuse this information to create parts later. So this is dimensioned out, and we'll go ahead and create a block from it. Again, select everything, and I have my make block. Okay, we can select insertion point and so on. Now, once the block is created, like I said, we can position it in the assembly. I'm going to position it the corner directly on the origin in this case. Now I need to create a representation of the second component. I'll go ahead and do that up here. We're going to go ahead and create a center line in here that's kind of offset. Okay, and then I have some dimensions and some points to locate to help me position this. And the dimensions are overall 15. The distance from here and here is 9. We have 100 millimeter distance total. And we have to position a few points here. The distance between these 2 points is going to be 25. And the distance from the end is going to be 10. I know this is futile watching me sketch here, but I think this will all make sense. We'll go ahead and make a block from that. That'll be our second block. And again, we can rename this if need be. Now, as far as positioning this particular block, I'm going to go ahead and take this point and drag it right onto the end here. And what that does for me is kind of gives me this kind of motion. You can see that I really don't want the bottom to rotate like that, so I may want to add another relationship there that locks that from spinning around. What I'm actually creating here is a layout for a clamp, like a Destaco clamp of some sort. Okay, let's go with our third component here. We'll go ahead and try to use a slot. Now you'll notice when I go to approach the slot command, it's not available. Now here's one of those drawbacks of not having all the tools available in assembly layout. But one of the comments on the slide was, even though it's available in the assembly layout, it may be accessible within the block command. So let's go ahead and create a new part file. And I'm going to lay out the block in a separate file. And we'll actually start with a sketch on the front plane, and we'll use my slot command. We'll go ahead and position this about the distance we want. We'll dimension it. This is 10, and the length is 125. And there's a point location somewhere on this edge That's 67 millimeters from the center. That's going to help me position it. Okay, we'll go ahead and make it a block. I'm in a part file now. We're going to go ahead and make it a block. Okay, once I have the block made, I need a way of getting it to the assembly, so I have to save the block out. And I'm just going to throw this right on my desktop. We're going to call this my slot block. Okay, now I really don't have any need for the part. There is no relationship here between the part and the block at this point. When I get back to the assembly, on my layout command manager or my layout toolbar, if I have it up, is an option for inserting a block. You browse for the SLD BLK file, which happens to be on my desktop. Go ahead and find that. There's my slot block, and we'll go ahead and drop it in. Okay. Now, it automatically keeps the insert block option up and allows me to place multiple blocks if I want to. Now, in this particular case, we're going to go ahead and place this endpoint on the end here, and this point is going to eventually be constrained using another component. Okay, so we have kind of our layout here. Now the other components are inserted blocks, so they become a little easier to work with here. So we'll go ahead and insert block, and we just browse to the other blocks that I have here. And the blocks that I need my hold down, and I need my link. These are just something that maybe were reused in another assembly or something to that matter. And we can continue to position these. In this case, we need those restrained coincident, and I need to restrain this to those points. We'll make those coincident as well. Now you can see what I have for motion here by just taking my my connection. We'll take the last one and place it here and make the block collinear. Now remember that each of these are treated as separate components. Now let's take a step back here. If I look in my confirmation corner, you'll see that it actually shows the layout sketch, the falling house icon. This is to let you know you're still in the layout. You're still in the layout sketch. Now, if I click on that, that does exit the sketch just like you would typically find. But what you won't find in the feature tree is you won't find a layout sketch. You won't find that feature to go back to. Now, the only indication to SolidWorks, or to you as a user to know that it's even there, if you look at the top of the feature tree, you'll see an icon for the broken house right next to the assembly icon. Now, the nice thing about that being there is that's where you get all of your commands related to assembly layouts. If I right-click on that top icon, I'm going to have a complete section that allows me to hide the layout. It's just like hiding a sketch, except the feature doesn't exist in the tree. Suppress it. If it's suppressed, I can unsuppress from here. Okay, I can delete it, or I can go back into it by selecting layout. Okay, going back into it allows me, again, to view that. Now look at the motion I was able to create using these separate components. Okay, now what I did is I just double-clicked in the graphics area. That got rid of that grid that you were seeing that was a sketch grid. And I can still, because I'm still in the sketch, I can still view that motion. Now how do I take this and create a part from it? We're going to take the initial base, and we need to create a 3D part from it now and reuse some of the information I did with the layout. If you right-click on it in the assembly, you're going to have an option to make a part from the block. Now we have two options. I'm going to show you right now the option on block. What this does is it restrains the sketch that you're going to create, or restrains the part to the plane in which the block is currently on. If you use project, it can be projected to other planes. I'm going to say on block here, and it asks me for a template. That's how I have my system set up for. Now what it does, it creates that part inside the assembly, and I want you to notice that it is a virtual component. Should be used to virtual components at this point. Those are components that only exist inside of the assembly. The way I tell that is with the brackets. So at this point, with the part in the assembly, I can do what I traditionally do, top-down design. I can edit the part. I go in here, I can go ahead and open a new sketch on the front plane. And I can go ahead and reuse some of this information. I'm going to go ahead and draw what I need. We need something like this. It's coming down around. This is just the layout for this particular part. Need to add some fillets in here. Go ahead and drop a couple in. Grab our dimensions. Make sure I accept my fillet command. And we'll grab some dimensions here. Fillet radius is 5. Now we want this fillet to be concentric to that outside edge. Again, I'm using the block data information. Okay, I can take the end of this, or the center of the circle, and I'm going to create a relationship between, again, my layout. I make it coincident there, and then I add my last dimension, which happens to be, I think, 17 here, 15. And we'll go ahead and place that in there. Okay. So very easy to get to this point. I can go ahead and extrude that using typical methods. We're going to do a 20 millimeter mid-plane. Now the part, as it always does when you create inside an assembly, does exist on its own. I can open it up and do any work on it here that I'd like. So if I want to come in here and add a couple 4 millimeter fillets to the bottom edges, not the face. Okay, maybe I want to shell this thing out, remove a few faces that I don't really need. And I'm left with my part. When I jump back to the assembly, you can see that the thing is still together, and I'm able to go ahead and test my assembly with that component in there. Okay, so I've taken, in this case, very little of the information. I really sketched around it, used it as kind of a basis for what I'm dealing with. Okay. Now a couple other neat things. I showed you a little bit of motion in here. I want to show you a couple other things in motion that we can do inside of 2D blocks. Here's an example of a sketch that has yet to be turned into a block. This is parts. So we're back in the part environment for a moment here. I need to create some blocks here. Let's go ahead and start creating those. I have 3 separate blocks that are actually going to act as a gear layout in this case. Now, again, I'm in a part file, which traditionally we don't have the type of motion that a gear needs inside of a part file. But I'm going to make that happen using some of the relationships that are available between blocks. So now I've gone ahead and created this. I'm going to create a relationship between this block and the origin and make them concentric. Now that allows this to spin, but these don't rotate relative to this gear spinning. There is a relationship between blocks that can be added called traction. I want to say this was 4 or 5 years ago this was added. If I select the 2 blocks, they called it traction. This tooltip actually calls it engage blocks. What this does is where they touch, it will be treated as an engagement point, such that if you rotate one, the other will rotate with it. And I'm going to also create one between this block and this block here and engage those. Now you can see what happens. Again, I'm in a part file, This will work in an assembly as well. This motion is kind of hard to see over the web, but these do rotate very smoothly on the screen. So another way, again, to lay out these small mechanical assemblies that you have. Another example, pulleys that require belts. This is, again, is a part file example, but can be done inside of an assembly. If I go to my sketch entities, we have the option for a belt or chain. Okay, that belt or chain command will work on blocks. These are block circles. We can select the cylindrical geometry that we're going to position it around. And this engages the belt to that geometry. Now when I'm able to test this, I get this type of motion. Okay. A couple other things I want to point out before we close here today. This is an example, a backhoe example. There are situations when you go to insert block. Oh, I got to get into my layout here. So go to layout, and then we can go to insert block and browse to the block I want to use. Let's see. That's that there. There are situations when you're reusing data that maybe something isn't quite the proper size. In this particular case, this backhoe needs a couple linkages. I'm not going to complete it here, but if I drop one of the linkages in at full scale, I have a choice over here to actually scale the block down. So I can say 70% and go ahead and put a smaller version of that same block over here. That being said, if I select the block, I also have an option to rotate the angle of that block on the fly here. Okay. If you find the position you want, you can physically lock the angle as well, so that can't rotate. So there are several tools in here to help us with this. Okay. Okay. Now I wanted to show you an example of an assembly, back to the assembly environment, using the projection technique. When you project a sketch block, it is not restrained to the plane where the block is tied to. And I have some examples here. If I go ahead and show these parts that already exist, we have kind of a backing plate where everything's going to be attached to in a cylinder here. But I need to take these arms and turn them into a solid model. They were done creating blocks like we've been talking about. So I can actually select both blocks in this case, right-click and make part from block. In this case, I'm going to project them, which is going to create a new sketch for us to use to turn into a solid. Okay. From here, we can go ahead and, again, under the grapple, take one of these and edit the part. And we'll take the sketch that exists. It projects that sketch as a copy of the block into the part file and allows me to go ahead and extrude it. Go to features here, we'll go ahead and extrude, and I'll give it 20 millimeters. Let's go bigger, 70 millimeters. Now you'll notice since this was a duplicate block, it was a block that was placed in several times, that it actually filled out the information for both. And I'm having a little video problem here. There you go. Let's see to fix it. It filled out the block for both, but with projection, I now have control over the depth of that component. It's not tied to the plane in which it was originally created. Okay. So I can actually come in here and mate this component up. So if I wanted to come in, actually I got to edit my part here, exit edit part, and I can come in here to the assembly level and physically mate those two components together. Now the nice thing about this type of layout and this type of motion is I can use the components to show the motion, or I can grab the sketch entities to still show the motion. They're still tied together completely. Now my last example for today, I have one more. This is more of a 2D. I just wanted to prove out the whole theory that this is a 3D sketch. Some of you may have seen this as an example in the past. Let's edit our layout. Again, you got to remember to be able to jump in and out of these layout sketches. It's something that's confused me as well. If I take this geometry here and I can make it collinear, that leaves me with some kind of sliding motion. I'm going to go ahead and take this endpoint and just fix it. Now these are already restrained pretty well for me, so I'm going to take the endpoint here and the endpoint here and place them coincident to their respective pieces. Now I can't rotate this handle because this block is tied to a particular plane. Because that's what we do when we create these blocks. We tie them to the planes that we're drawn on. But like I said, this is a 3D sketch. So if I decide to remove or delete that on plane, now I'm able to grab the end of this 2D geometry, and hopefully this comes through. I'm able to rotate it in 3D space and actually make this thing work. That being said, some of these components have already been created for me. You can have a mix and match of 2D and 3D, making your assemblies work. Again, this is the same type of motion. Okay. Now, I hope that this was beneficial for you folks today. We didn't spend a lot of time in the sketching environment because it really focused on blocks and assembly block layout. I really believe that using blocks with less restraints will help you a little bit. A couple other things before we get going here. I'm in my layout, and you'll notice there's colors. I'm going to hide these components here. I almost forgot to show you folks this. The colors are actually coming from my line format toolbar. You can select a block and go in, actually once in the part file, that's how it works. You can select the block. Here you got to select it in the graphics area, and you can select line color and actually apply a color to the block. This helps you to distinguish between the components in a layout. You can do this in parts or in assemblies. But there's one command on here I definitely want to point out. It's called color display mode. We're used to using colors in SolidWorks as a way of looking at whether something's restrained or unrestrained that needs more sketch constraints. With this option toggled off, not depressed, it will show you the colors you've applied to those blocks or to that geometry. If I push that button in, it shows you the result of the constraints on that geometry. So don't get discouraged if you've applied colors to blocks or sketch geometry, but it's not showing. Simple problem is that you need to use this color display mode to be able to flip between whether I'm viewing if it's under restrained or not, or whether I'm viewing the colors individually. I guess at this point I'll take any questions that anyone has on the Lunch and Learn. I do have some news about the next 2 months Lunch and Learns. We're going to continue on the theme of free training, free information. These aren't not sales-based webinars, but the next 4 will be 2 in May, 2 in June, are going to start to look at the 2011 enhancements, and we're going to start to break those down. I know we've done What's News and we've had you in, but we haven't really taught you how to use some of the commands. So the next 4 Lunch and Learns, we're going to take requests for the commands in 2011 that you want analyzed even further. We'll get into it. We'll talk to SolidWorks about the commands, what it's doing behind the hood, and really get in depth on those commands. So each webinar may have a combination of a couple to 10 to 12 different commands that we'll cover. I do recommend that if you want to put your name out there for a particular command you want reviewed, go ahead and pop me an email at kevin@caddimensions.com. I'll make sure that gets covered. I hope this was beneficial today. I will look forward to doing Lunch and Learn with you starting next month. I have a question about whether the presentation will be online. It is being recorded as we speak, and I will probably be posting it in the morning. So probably by tomorrow afternoon this presentation will be available. Okay, if there's not any other questions, we'll go ahead and cut out for today, and have a good day and enjoy it.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.